comes down, we'll hear all of us soon.
He thinks it's really important on this day, now 22 years later, to certainly remember the service and the sacrifice of all those affected by those terrible attacks on 9/11.
Yeah, I mean, no, I'm not for a continuing resolution. I mean, what I'm for is actually funding a government to do its job.
He has my full and complete endorsement for President of the United States of America.
I support DeSantis because I've been in Florida for 20 years, and he's probably been our best governor that we've had.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. The House returns from its August recess tomorrow ahead of a deadline to avert a government shutdown. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy is facing pressure from conservative Republicans to pass their priorities, but those provisions have little chance of making it through the democratically controlled Senate. Lawmakers of both parties have until the end of this month to pass spending bills to keep the government fully funded. For more, let's bring in CBS News congressional correspondent Nicole Killian. Nicole, I'm not going to burden you with a question about what's going to happen, just with a question about where do things stand now?
Yeah, please don't, because I think the short answer is we simply don't know. Look, I mean, there are a lot of variables here, and right now it's just a matter of everyone not being on the same page and people kind of driving in parallel lanes. You know, here in the Senate, you have lawmakers preparing to move forward on a minibus or a set of appropriations bills as soon as tomorrow. Over in the House, they're also prepared to move forward on a series of appropriations packages. But the bottom line is they don't think they can get through it in time. So there is talk of doing a short-term funding bill or a continuing resolution. And that's where more disagreement lies, in the sense that you have, particularly among House Republicans, some who feel that any type of funding should be tied to potentially opening up an impeachment inquiry into President Biden. You have other Republicans who disagree with that idea and simply want perhaps more border security money in some type of short-term spending package. And then here in the Senate, you have some lawmakers who want to make sure that Ukraine is funded properly, that military operations there get due funding and aid. But over in the House, there are many members who don't feel that way and want that aid stripped out. So again, not everyone on the same page. And so I spoke earlier today with Congressman Chip Roy, who is one of the lawmakers who opposes any type of short-term funding package. And I asked him what he would say to some of his Senate Republican colleagues who don't want to shut down.
They're just being Senate Republicans, and the American people are tired of it. The Senate Republicans have never found a fight that they want to shy away from. I think they should actually stand up.
So even though a lot of lawmakers are on different pages here, one thing that is consistent here in the Senate is that whether you talk to moderate Republicans or more conservative Republicans, they're pretty much in agreement that they don't think a shutdown is a good idea. But over in the House, some, like Roy, are willing to take that risk.
Cole, as you well know, Washington is a city with its own language, particularly on Capitol Hill. A minibus is not a vehicle. You know that, but our audience may not. An omnibus, what does that mean? That means all the spending bills put together. That's where omni comes from. Minibus means some of the spending bills put together, a smaller package. But if I heard you correctly, Nicole, there aren't the votes in either chamber for either a small minibus or a large omnibus. So we have to find some other resolution. Is there any path to that resolution?
Well, right now it seems everybody wants to get off the bus, but I guess to be more specific in terms of this minibus, I mean, look, I think there is some consensus in the Senate that they want to move forward with a series of different appropriations packages, which is why they're teeing up that vote for this week. And keep in mind, a lot of this stems from that debt deal that was reached last spring, where there was a commitment to try to return to regular order, where, you know, the government is funded under these appropriations bills instead of kind of these short-term funding stopgap measures. So that being said, that is what they're trying to start the process of doing by moving forward with a series of some of these appropriations bills, not all of them. And again, because it will take some additional time, that is why some believe that there is a need for just a short-term funding gap until they can get through all 12 of these measures. So again, it seems like there's consensus in the Senate, but over in the House, there's a lot of disagreement simply because many House Republicans Republicans want to go back to fiscal year 22 measures. This was something that they kind of pushed for in that debt limit deal. Didn't fully win agreement as far as that particular parameter. And so that is where there's some disparity, because in the Senate, they are open to additional funding, but over in the House, they want to pare things back. And so that's kind of where we could see both chambers at loggerheads, in addition to both chambers kind of having their own issues with some of the bills before them, if that makes sense.
And Nicole, we've got about 45 seconds left. I just want to drill down on the point you just made. So what House Republicans want to do is they want to go below the negotiated spending limits achieved to avert the debt ceiling default. Is that correct?
More or less. I mean, that's kind of what they want to do. But again, you'll recall when that debt limit deal was reached and there was this notion of trying to go back to fiscal 22 spending levels, that wasn't necessarily what was agreed to, but rather it was agreed to that funding levels would be kind of frozen at current levels. And then you had lawmakers over here in the Senate who believed that there should be some supplemental aid for Ukraine and wanted to add that in. And that is still part of the debate, at least with respect to not only long-term, but the short-term funding measure that is before Congress.
And you throw disaster aid in there, and it becomes a very, very difficult proposition. Nicole Killian.
It's a big, big bus.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Buses everywhere, just no riders yet. Nicole Killian, thank you so very much. President Biden wrapped up a trip to Asia with a stop in Vietnam and a speech at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Anchorage to mark 22 years since the 9/11 terrorist attacks. During the 5-day trip, the president met with world leaders in New Delhi at the G20 summit and in Hanoi as tensions between the United States and China appear to be intensifying. CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes joins us now. Nancy, summarize the trip, if you'd be so kind, for those who over the weekend might have been doing something other than monitoring the president's movements and events.
Sure. I think that you could summarize it, Major, by saying that the president was working to counter Chinese aggression while simultaneously bringing down the temperature with China when it comes to the U.S.-China relationship, trying to achieve those very different ends at the same time. So he went to India for the G20 summit, where he was meeting with the leaders of the world's 20 largest economies, and he was looking to strengthen those relationships, particularly relationships with leaders in that region, and also looking to boost infrastructure spending by those leaders to counter Chinese infrastructure investment around the world. But when asked about China, he said, look, we don't want to contain China in any way. In fact, we want China to have a good economy. It's not in our interest for China to have a weak economy, but we just want to make sure that China plays by the same rules as everyone else. From India, he went to Vietnam, same story. A neighbor of China's, a nation that in the past, of course, was at odds with the United States, but working to bolster that relationship so the U.S. has many alliances within the region and sends a clear message to China, as President Biden said out loud, that the U.S. is a Pacific nation and that it's not going anywhere.
And Nancy, from the White House perspective, does the set of talks with India and the U.S. relationship with that country look to the Biden administration and the White House as a counterweight to China's influence throughout the region?
Yes, especially because India and China are experiencing some of their own conflicts right now. In fact, that's one of the theories that's floating out there for why the leader of China, President Xi himself, did not come and attend the G20 in person like so many other world leaders did. It's one of many theories, but nevertheless, it kind of cleared the stage, if you will, for President Biden and Narendra Modi, the leader of India, to really tout their strengthening relationship, even though these two leaders are at odds over many things, most notably their view of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They went back and forth all weekend, Major, while working to come out with a communique that all of these nations could agree with. Obviously, the U.S. wanted to put it in very stark terms that Russia had invaded, that it needs to get out. India has a much different relationship with Russia. It's still a big trading partner of Russia's, and so they wanted to be much more circumspect.
When the history of the Ukraine war is finally recorded, India's position, oftentimes equivocal, will be noted. Nancy Cordes at the White House, thank you so very much. New CBS News polling finds Americans, well, they have concerns about elected officials over the age of 75. Next, we'll take a look at those numbers. You are streaming America Decides.
With your vote in this election, Joe Biden's country, for a short period of time, hopefully just a short period of time, it ends on November 5th, 2024. We have to take care. We have to take our country back.
Welcome back to America Decides. That was former President Trump rallying voters in South Dakota, where he picked up the endorsement of Governor Kristi Noem. Meanwhile, CBS News has learned the former president is requesting through his lawyers that federal judge overseeing his election interference case be recused. Trump's lawyers are arguing that Judge Tanya Chutkan's statements made in the sentencing of other January 6th defendants raise questions about her impartiality. To talk about this and other political news, Joel Payne and Hogan Gidley join us now. Joel is a CBS News political contributor, Democratic strategist, and chief communications officer for Move On. Hogan served as White House deputy press secretary in the Trump administration. He also served as national press secretary for Trump's 2020 re-election campaign. Hogan, let me start with you. This is somewhat late-breaking news this afternoon. The Trump lawyer requests that Judge Tanya Chutkan be removed. Your reaction?
I think there'll be a lot of maneuvers by both sides to try and get this thing over and done with the way they want it over and done with, if that makes any sense.
Prosecutors and defendants typically have a different definition of that.
Absolutely correct. I think one of the people I focus on in these instances is someone I worked with on impeachment really closely, and that's Alan Dershowitz. And one of the things he points to consistently is venue here is a problem for Donald Trump. You're talking about Atlanta. You're talking about Washington, D.C., a place.
In this case, it's about Tanya Chutkan, which is D.C.
I understand that. And 95% of the people here voted for Joe Biden, so he feels like that's a problem, too. And so when you take a look at New York, issues with the potential voter or the pool for jurors, if you will. So I'm looking at it writ large. But in this particular instance, it appears as though Donald Trump is going to try and hang around this case, some issues that the judge has said in the past when she obviously went after some of the J6 folks. So it makes sense they're going to try and do this. I expect this is the beginning of these type of political maneuvers.
Many more legal maneuvers to come,
Absolutely.
is your perspective. Joel,
Absolutely.
as you well know, the prosecution in this case, the special counsel Jack Smith's office, has raised with Judge Chutkan a couple of times now the things that former President Trump has said on social media might be prejudicial to the jury pool, might in fact do something to the way this case is heard, injurious to a fair trial. So it's not just one side on this particular ledger.
Yeah, look, I feel like the whole theory here that President Trump and his associates are trying to go for is just a delay. Delay helps them in every way. One, it allows them to own more of the news cycle and more of the airspace here in D.C., but also it just allows them to delay the inevitability of having to deal with the trial. It doesn't seem like he's going to be successful with his attempts to change venue and to change the atmospherics around this trial. And it seems like at some point he's going to have to face justice in Judge Chutkan's courtroom.
Back to the weekend, Kristi Noem, governor of South Dakota, endorsed the former president. There was signage there that said Trump Noem. Is that indicative of anything, Hogan?
Not to my knowledge. Obviously, I don't work for the former president now, but she is obviously an attractive candidate.
Do you think she is someone that the inner circle is considering seriously if he becomes the nominee as a running mate?
Again, I've not spoken to the inner circle about this, but I think it would be foolish not to consider someone like Kristi Noem.
Why?
I think she's a very effective messenger. Obviously, I think Donald Trump having someone like her on the ticket, a female from a Midwestern area of the country, would be good for him. High Plains
is probably more accurate.
High Plains, sure, but would be good for him too. And and we'll have to, if we does select Kristi Noem, then we can start talking about her arms and not Michelle Obama's anymore. She had them on full display.
Meaning
Very
guns.
important. Oh, yeah, yeah. So there you go. Eat your heart out, Michelle.
Not actual firearms, just, biceps.
Just
That's all we're talking. Joel Payne, I want to play for you something that New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu said over the weekend about the GOP field and former President Trump. Let's take a quick listen to
The fact that former President Trump is a former president, the leader of the party, and he doesn't even really have 50% of the Republican base support tells you there's a real problem there. That's actually an incredibly low number. So you have all these other candidates out there, 8 of them at this point. That field's going to keep winnowing down, I think, as we've talked about a lot. If it gets to one-on-one, Trump and another candidate, that other candidate is undoubtedly going to beat him.
So, Joel, this sort of reminds those of us who've been around the block of the perpetual Republican fantasy about the one-on-one against former President Trump. Hasn't happened yet, isn't happening now, but evaluate what Governor Sununu said.
Well, I don't know who's going to win the Sununu primary. That's been one of my favorite things to watch from the sidelines here in D.C. I actually think the point that he's making is a good one about a one-on-one race. But when does that one-on-one race emerge? It's one thing for it to emerge now. It's another thing for it to emerge in December or in January or in February when President Trump theoretically has already built up all the momentum towards winning the nomination and locking it down again. So I think the sooner the better. Just talking to Hogan, not that I am going to be casting my lot with any Republicans, but if I was a Republican, if I was a never Trumper or a mainstream Republican, I'd think about someone like a Nikki Haley who I could get behind now, start pushing folks out of the race. She's shown that she's got upward trajectory in the race. I'm wondering if you're going to start to see mainstream Republicans start to make that type of calculus.
Just the last part of what Governor Sununu said. If it's one-on-one, the other candidate undoubtedly is going to beat Trump. Do you even believe that?
No, he's wrong. In fact, a lot of polling shows the exact opposite. Trump still wins. It'd be a little bit closer because there wouldn't be a field that was kind of split, if you will, the way it is with so many candidates. But the fact is, Donald Trump still is the voice of the Republican Party. He still is a former president. And while we've seen in years past people kind of shoot up in Iowa and New Hampshire, look, I work for Santorum and Huckabee, both of whom were at 1%. So the people low in the polls don't bother me. But this is unique because you have a former president, an America First president, who has a record to run on. And I think a lot of people are saying, wait a minute, we want him to have that second term we feel like he deserved. I don't care if it's a one-on-one race or if it's a one-on-10-person race.
Just really quickly, we've still never seen that one-on-one Trump versus anti-Trump in a sitting.
Nope.
True. We've seen versions of it. We've seen a plurality of Trump. But we've never seen that. I think that's what Sununu's
I want to show you two fine gentlemen something in our CBS News polling over the weekend. Americans in politics disagree on almost everything. Here's one thing. We found one thing that most Americans of both parties agree on. Concerns about elected officials over age of 75. Let's pull up the number, the polling data. 80% believe they could be out of touch. 78% believe that they would have a hard time living up to the rigors of the job. So what do you think, Joel, about this idea that we are getting as a country a little less comfortable with seniority as applied to anyone over 75, which would fit Biden and Trump?
I call this the if I had my druthers primary. Okay, so if I had my druthers, would I prefer that all of our leaders not average in the upper 70s, 80s? Sure, not because of ageism, but because I think having fresh perspective, fresh ideas is important. That said, Joe Biden has not done anything, has not performed in a way that would suggest that his age is affecting his performance. You look at a Mitch McConnell, it does seem like his age is starting to affect his performance. A Dianne Feinstein, it is affecting her performance. Joe Biden is not. So I don't think all of these scenarios are all one and the same.
Hogan, you are a one-liner machine. You got 20 seconds.
Well, I don't know what president you're watching, but Joe Biden consistently can't get through press conferences when he has the reporters in front of him, the questions in front of him, the answers in front of him, and a lot of times with a teleprompter, he stumbles, he stutters. It's not his age, it's his cognitive ability, it's his physical ability that people see and realize it's in steep decline.
Hogan Gidley, you get the last word. You'll be back at this table yet again, I'm sure. We'll continue the conversation also with Joel Payne. Thanks so very much. President Biden marked the 9/11 terrorist attacks in Alaska, while Vice President Harris visited Ground Zero. How other leaders marked the day. That's coming up next. You are streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. President Biden spoke to service members and first responders at an Air Force base in Anchorage, Alaska today to commemorate the September 11th attacks. Meanwhile, in New York City, Vice President Kamala Harris spent the morning at the annual memorial service held at Ground Zero. She was among other familiar political faces like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, New York Senator Chuck Schumer, and former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani. They were surrounded by thousands of mourners, including first responders and friends and families of those who lost their lives.
I lost my dad here. Never get easy. It's the same thing all over again. It hurts.
It still feels a little bit haunting from that day.
I haven't stepped foot on his grounds since October of 2001.
Joining us now is CBS News White House reporter Bo Erickson. He is in Alaska, where the president spoke earlier today. Bo, good to see you.
Hi, Major. How are you doing?
Very well. Summarize the afternoon for you as it played out at Elmendorf Air Force Base.
Yeah, so the president is still here shaking hands with around 1,000 service members that heard his remarks here today in Alaska. And it's actually the venue that caused some criticism for President Biden and the White House. And that's because some 9/11 families were questioning the choice of this venue. And some people may be asking, why is the president in Alaska on 9/11? And it's really a two-parter. It's first because it's logistical. He was coming back from that summit in Asia. This is where Air Force One refuels. And also, the president tried to address some of that criticism today, saying that distance does not diminish the pain of the day. And he said how this Air Force base scrambled planes from all over Alaska on 9/11 to defend the skies. We can also listen to a bite here how President Biden tried to sympathize with those 9/11 families who lost loved ones in the attacks.
But we'll never forget that when faced with evil and an enemy who sought to tear us apart, we endured. We endured. But while every year we mark this hallowed day, it's never easy. To anyone here or anyone across the country who's grieving a lost child, parent, spouse, sibling, friend, or coworker, to all those who still bear the wounds from the Syrian September morning, I know how hard it is.
Finally, Major, the president also called for national unity as we move forward here. And he said that the power of national unity is how we honor those who lost their lives in 9/11.
And, Bo, I think it's worth pointing out that amid that criticism, other presidents have not gone to 9/11 attack sites on the day of commemoration. They've done events from the White House, but not necessarily Ground Zero or Shanksville or the Pentagon. But this is the first time a sitting president wasn't at either the White House or an attack site on 9/11, part of what I gather the White House is describing as an evolution of the way our country will, in the foreseeable future, commemorate this awful, awful anniversary.
That is correct. And also, the Biden administration made sure that other administration officials did attend those memorials. Specifically, in addition to the vice president in New York, the first lady was at the Pentagon attack site, and the second gentleman, Doug Emhoff, was also at the Flight 93 Memorial in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Major?
And, Bo, you said the president is still there shaking hands. Is that true?
Yes, I think he's still, it's been about 45 minutes and he's shaking hands with, it seems like, every last service member here. This is a good image for him to project, and he also wanted to spend some time with the troops here. And then we are going to see him take off on Air Force One very shortly back to Washington, D.C. after his few days in Asia.
On the scene for us at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Anchorage, Alaska, Bo Erickson. Thank you. That does it for today. Thanks for watching. You are streaming CBS News.